Somewhere in a cracked land grant, a fading church register, or a passenger list untouched for centuries, your last name might be waiting for you. Some American surnames are not just names. They are fragments of colonial power, stitched into old charters, whispered in manor houses, buried in Virginia ledgers and New England town books. Tonight we decode 10 surnames that may trace back to a founding family who helped shape early America. Land, loyalty, fortune, betrayal. And by the end, one surname surfaces that was not built by ambition alone. It was handed an entire province by a king.
Number 10. Bradford. If your family carries this name, you may have heard it your whole life without knowing what it once meant on a storm-battered ship in 1620. The older records connect this surname to William Bradford, the Plymouth Colony governor who helped write the Mayflower Compact and kept a starving settlement alive through its first brutal winter. Families with this name were often associated with separatist congregations fleeing religious persecution in England, then Holland, then finally risking everything on the Atlantic. That is not a small detail. This was a family willing to lose everything for control over its own future. The twist is that Bradford descendants did not stay quietly in Plymouth. Some intermarried into powerful merchant and political families across New England, spreading influence far beyond one small colony, while others pushed west with each generation, carrying the name into new towns, new courts, and new congregations. If this is your surname, the old record suggests survival was never an accident. It was a decision made in a freezing harbor by people who refused to turn back. Picture faded parchment, a ship's manifest, and a colony clinging to a rocky coastline through a winter that killed nearly half its settlers, and you begin to see what this name carried. The next name did not survive a harbor. It survived a courtroom. Number 9. Alden. This surname is historically associated with John Alden, one of the last surviving Mayflower passengers, and his wife, Priscilla Mullins, whose courtship became one of early America's most repeated colonial stories. Church records and Plymouth Colony documents place this family at the center of the settlement's earliest legal and religious life. Most people never hear that Alden himself later stood trial, accused in the fallout of a Massachusetts political conspiracy that nearly destroyed his reputation. That is where the story turns darker. A name tied to romance was also tied to danger, suspicion, and a fight to clear the family's honor in front of colonial magistrates. Genealogical records show the Alden line multiplying rapidly across New England, making this one of the most widely claimed Mayflower surnames in America today. If this name sits in your family tree, you may be carrying one of the most documented bloodlines to survive that first fragile colony. Old town registers and burial inscriptions across Massachusetts still carry this name on stones worn smooth by 3 centuries of coastal weather. The next family did not arrive on a ship. It arrived with a Dutch trading company and never let go of the harbor. Number 8. Stuyvesant. The name sounds foreign, and it is, but it became deeply rooted in what would eventually become New York City. Old Dutch colonial records connect this surname to Peter Stuyvesant, the last Director General of New Netherland, a stubborn, iron-willed administrator who ruled the colony before the English seized it in 1664. Families with this name were tied to Dutch trading power, land grants along the Hudson, and a rigid vision of colonial order. Here is the twist. Stuyvesant fought the English takeover to the very end. Yet, after the surrender, his family did not disappear. Land records show his descendants retained property and influence in New York for generations under British and later American rule. A name built to resist conquest ended up quietly surviving it instead. If this surname appears in your family, the older records suggest your ancestors watched an empire quietly change hands and adapted rather than vanished entirely. Dutch land deeds and later English property rolls both carry this family's name side by side, a rare paper trail spanning two competing empires. The next family did not just adapt, they were granted their own private kingdom along the river. Number 7. Van Rensselaer. This surname is historically associated with one of the most extraordinary land arrangements in colonial American history, the patroonship system used by the Dutch West India Company. Kilian van Rensselaer received a land grant so enormous it became known as Rensselaersvik, stretching across what is now the Albany region, making his family something close to feudal lords inside an American colony. Church and land records from the era describe tenant farmers, mills, and entire settlements operating under this family's authority long after Dutch rule ended. That is not a small detail. This was not just wealth. It was governing power over other colonists. The twist is that this family's control lasted so long that some tenants were still legally bound to Van Rensselaer landholding terms well into the 1800s, sparking the anti-rent wars, a real armed uprising against their authority. If this name is yours, the historical record points toward a family that once held something closer to a private province than a farm. Rent ledgers and manor court records from the Hudson Valley still list tenants paying dues to this family generations after the Dutch flag came down. The next surname did not rule quietly. It ruled loudly, from a Hudson Valley manor with its own private army of tenants. Number 6. Livingston. Old colonial land patents connect this surname to Robert Livingston, a Scottish immigrant who built one of the largest privately controlled landholdings in colonial New York, known as Livingston Manor. Families with this name became deeply embedded in New York's political, legal, and revolutionary history, producing signers of founding American documents and powerful judges. Livingston descendants would go on to administer oaths of office to a newly sworn president and negotiate one of the largest land purchases in American history. The twist here cuts against expectation. A name rooted in enormous private land power later became central to revolutionary politics, with Livingstons helping draft and support the break from the very crown that had allowed their family's wealth to exist in the first place. Historical records describe this as one of the clearest examples of colonial elite families repositioning themselves as founders of a new nation rather than defenders of an old one. If your family carries this surname, the record suggests an inherited instinct for reading power correctly and moving before the ground shifts beneath you. Manor deeds, Revolutionary Committee rolls, and later judicial appointments all carry this name across nearly 2 centuries of American power. The next name did not read the room. It built the room, then handed the keys to Maryland. Number 5. Calvert. This surname is historically tied to George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, and his descendants, who received a royal charter establishing the colony of Maryland as their own proprietary territory. Land grant documents and colonial charters describe an almost unheard-of level of personal authority, a family effectively owning and governing an entire colony under the English crown, appointing its own governors and collecting its own rents directly from settlers. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable for a supposedly ordinary surname. The Calverts, who were Catholic in a fiercely Protestant empire, used their colony partly as a refuge for religious minorities, yet still ruled through inherited noble privilege rather than elected consent. That contradiction defined Maryland's earliest decades, caught between tolerance and top-down control by one family's bloodline. If this surname is in your family history, the older records suggest an inherited connection to one of the only colonies in America founded explicitly as private property under royal law. The original 1632 charter still survives in English archives, ink and wax proof that one family's name once carried the weight of a province. The next surname did not receive a colony from tolerance. It received one from ambition and blood ties reaching straight into the English aristocracy. Number 4. Randolph. Virginia land and legal records place this surname at the absolute center of what historians often call Virginia's first families, an interconnected colonial aristocracy that controlled land, courts, and political office for generations. The Randolphs intermarried so extensively with other elite Virginia bloodlines that later genealogical research links this surname to an extraordinary number of prominent early American figures, including describable ties reaching toward Thomas Jefferson's own family line. Most people never hear that part. A name that sounds almost background in American history was actually load-bearing, holding up an entire colonial power structure through marriage, land, and court appointments. Its members sat on the governor's council, held military commissions, and filled the pews of the churches that recorded every birth, marriage, and death for an entire ruling class. The twist is that Randolph family disputes over land and inheritance became so severe that court records from the era read like a slow-motion family war, fought with lawsuits instead of swords. If this surname belongs to your family, the record suggests deep roots inside Virginia's ruling class, not on its edges, but at its very center. Old parish registers and county court minutes still record this family witnessing land transfers and sitting on juries that decided their neighbors' fates. The next name did not rule from Virginia's courts. It ruled from its plantations, and its wealth reshaped an entire colony's economy. Number 3. Carter. Colonial Virginia records connect this surname to Robert Carter, known in his own lifetime as King Carter, a man whose land holdings, enslaved labor force, and political offices made him arguably the most powerful private individual in early Virginia. Land surveys from the period describe holdings so vast they crossed multiple counties, alongside church patronage, judicial authority, and a personal fortune that rivaled anything in the colonies. He served on the governor's council, controlled vestries that decided who received poor relief and who did not, and left an estate so large it took his heirs years to fully divide it. That is not a small detail. This is a name that quite literally earned a royal nickname from ordinary colonists, not because he was royalty, but because his power felt indistinguishable from it. The twist is that this fortune was built directly on the brutal system of chattel slavery, a history the family's later descendants, including U.S. presidents connected by marriage and lineage, would spend generations navigating politically and morally. If this surname is yours, the record points toward a bloodline positioned at the direct intersection of colonial fortune, political dominance, and America's most painful historical contradictions. Surviving plantation ledgers and probate inventories from Carter's estate still list holdings so extensive that historians have spent decades simply cataloging them. The next family did not build fortune inside one colony. It was asked to help design the entire framework of one. Number 2. Winthrop. This surname is historically inseparable from John Winthrop, the Puritan leader who delivered the famous shipboard sermon envisioning Massachusetts Bay as a model society for the world to watch. Colonial charters and town founding documents place this family at the direct center of New England's earliest religious, legal, and political architecture, with Winthrop serving repeatedly as governor. Families with this name were tied to strict religious governance, banishments of dissenters, and an almost obsessive belief that their colony's survival was a test watched by God himself. Under his leadership, dissenters like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams were tried and cast out, a decision colonial court records still describe in exacting, uncomfortable detail. Here is the twist most people miss. The same family that enforced rigid religious conformity also produced later descendants who became scientists, reformers, and political figures who pushed against the very rigidity their ancestor had once demanded. A name built on control eventually helped produce change. If this surname is carried in your family, the older records suggest a bloodline present at the exact founding moment New England defined its identity.
Town founding charters, sermon transcripts, and colonial governors' records all place this name at the very first meetings that decided how an entire region would be run. But the final name on this list did not just help define a colony. It was given one directly by a king's own hand. Number 1. Penn. And now we arrive at the surname that changes the scale of everything on this list. This name is tied directly to William Penn, whose family was owed a massive debt by King Charles II of England. Rather than repay that debt in currency, the Crown issued a royal charter in 1681, granting Penn an enormous stretch of American land outright, a territory that would become Pennsylvania, named not for humility, but ironically for Penn's own father. Royal charters, land grant documents, and English aristocratic records connect this family not to distant nobility, but to direct, personal, documented royal favor. That is not folklore.
That is a king settling a financial debt with an entire province. The twist is staggering. Penn used this extraordinary royal gift to attempt something almost none of the other names on this list did: a colony built on religious tolerance, fair treatment of native populations through negotiated treaties, and Quaker principles that rejected the aristocratic controls seen in Calvert's Maryland or Van Rensselaer's Manor. He personally negotiated with the Lenape, drafted a framework of government limiting his own power, and welcomed persecuted religious minorities that other colonies had turned away at gunpoint. A name born from royal debt became a symbol of colonial conscience. If this surname is anywhere in your family history, the record suggests a connection to one of the only instances in American colonial history where a king personally handed one family an entire territory, and that family tried, imperfectly, to build something fairer with it. The original 1681 charter still exists today, sealed with royal authority, proof that this name was never ordinary. These 10 surnames are not simply labels passed down on paper. They are compressed histories, carrying the weight of ships that nearly sank, courts that nearly collapsed families, kings who traded land like currency, and ordinary people who refused to disappear when empires shifted beneath them. A name on a mailbox or a passport may look ordinary, but trace it back far enough, and it can lead to a Plymouth Winter, a Hudson Valley Manor, a Maryland charter, or a royal debt settled with an entire colony. Some of these families built their fortunes through brutal systems that still shape this country's reckoning with its own past, and some tried, however imperfectly, to build something fairer. Both realities are part of the same inheritance, and both are worth understanding honestly.
Comment your surname below, along with the region, colony, or migration story your family carries, and tell us which forgotten name you want decoded next. Somewhere out there, another ordinary surname is still waiting to reveal the kingdom, colony, or bloodline hidden inside it.